All right. Hello, UIKonf. It's so great to be here. I've come a few years back, a few years in a row, actually, just to enjoy the conference. And it's nice to be up here and talking to you guys. And what I want to bring up today is maybe another critical conversation, but it's something that I feel is really important to have at this point. Who here has been using Swift or has at least programmed with Swift at all? So that's the vast majority of you. So I think we'd all agree that whether it's a perfectly refined product at this point, it's clear that Apple sees it as the future of development. Now, a common complaint that people have had as they've been trying out Swift, as they've been building Swift apps in production, is that the language shows incredible promise, but the tooling often just doesn't live up to that promise. And so I think that this is a problem because it really discourages us from pushing the language to its boundaries, using it at its full potential. And I really do think that it's within our power to fix this. So just a bit of background. I work at a company called Realm. We build a modern database for iOS and Android. And so I work on the Objective-C and the Swift side of things. And when Swift was announced just about a year ago, we were super excited about the prospects of the language. And we got together and we started prototyping a few ideas. And really, within a few days, we had some pretty interesting concepts, I think. You know, really leveraging generics and really trying to bring the powerful language features to a database. And so we set forth on this adventure that ended up taking much longer than we were expecting to essentially ship both an Objective-C interface and a Swift interface. And so this is kind of a little bit about the story of what we felt the tooling was like and where we felt it was lacking. And so let's go back in time for a bit and take a look at the WWDC announcement. You've got Craig Federighi up there. Everyone's clapping. They're super excited, wide-eyed. Okay? We're being promised that this is going to be a simpler language, that this is going to be a safer language. We're being promised flying blimps. Okay? We're being promised the world. And ultimately, once we actually start playing with the thing, we get this. And we start to realize, really, how much work there still is left to do to really make this a stable development platform. And so as soon as we're starting to do some of this real work, we start to see where the holes are. And we start to see where the problems are. And you know, we kind of have this instinct as developers, as programmers, to focus on what's wrong, what's broken. We're debugging our code, constantly looking for problems. And I think we especially do this of other people's projects. And Apple's work is no exception. And so what is the problem? Well, is there a problem in the first place? Well, I think so. There's some pretty tangible problems, and some of these still apply today, but they were especially relevant when Swift came out, and even when Swift became 1.0. There were tools that we felt we needed, tools that we've had for a long time in Objective-C that just were conspicuously absent. The tools that we did have sometimes felt a little incomplete. Like there were some really critical features that we would need that just aren't there. And the tools that we did have and the features that they had were sometimes really buggy. And I really understand, or I think we all understand, the tight constraints that the Swift team and Apple in general is under to be providing something that's this innovative and this new and this different, really. But nonetheless, this is kind of the end result, is that we have this kind of half-baked tooling solution, and we've got to do something about it. And so these are just a handful of the tangible problems that we end up facing. But there are some bigger problems. Apple's extremely private when it comes to this stuff. They're not going to be telling us weeks or months in advance, or even as they're doing work on something. We're kept in the dark. Apple is too private. And so it's hard for us to necessarily make the business decision, or even just the personal decision of investing time in this new platform that we're not exactly sure if it's going to be at a stable state by the time that we actually need to ship something. Apple tends to release its new tools on a yearly basis. And they tend to be pretty secretive about these releases, and they tend to really aim for big announcements and to surprise people. I bring you back to that first slide where we had a handful of people in the audience that were completely blown away by this concept of Swift. No one saw it coming. But that's a problem. It's a problem because we can't wait until next WWDC to ship an app. We have other constraints. We need to make sure that our company is profitable, or we need to make sure that we're not spending all this time in vain. And ultimately, Apple may sometimes be focused on different aspects of the ecosystem of the development tool chain. And so all of this is completely understandable. But the problem is when we look at all this and we say, oh, well, that's what we have to live with. Only Apple can do this. That is not true. We can really take matters into our own hands. And actually, several people, and probably most of you in this room, are shining examples of this. And you've created projects, you've created tooling, all to improve the Swift experience. But I really do think that we can do more. And I'd say generally in the industry, there's this tendency to just cope, to just accept things as is and say, well, it's not really something that we're capable of doing to fix this problem. And so we look at the world burning around us and we say, we'll make it work. This is fine. We'll survive. We'll ship. I really think that we can be better than that, and we don't have to feel helpless. And so I think it's interesting to see how other communities actually treat this problem, and really to what extent they have a similar problem. So for example, JavaDoc was developed by Oracle. And so that was something that was officially supported for Java. Same thing with GoDoc for the Go language. But then there are other tools that kind of birth out of the community. So tools like RDoc and Yard, which were developed by independent developers, and then eventually kind of accepted as the general best practice. And so we should really be doing the same thing ourselves, and we are, but we should be doing more. So I think a good way to kind of look at this problem and to recap a little bit what might be missing is just to go through it. But there is a lot that is still missing even to this day. So here are a handful of different concepts, projects that would help developers build better apps with Swift that Apple certainly hasn't really released, or not in any tangible sense anyway. So package managers come to mind, refactoring tools, automatic code style detection and enforcement. So some linter or documentation generation, very critical aspects of development. Managing versions for Swift, something that Apple has actively tried to avoid. Doing things like fuzzy testing, or even just testing frameworks in general. And thankfully, of this list, pretty much all of them have been tackled by the community. We have CocoaPods, we have Carthage for package management, we have great tools like AppCode, and the AppCode people here at UIKonf, so I really do encourage you to go talk to them. They've built something amazing. We just released something at Realm just today, actually, called SwiftLint, which uses the Swift AST to look at your code style and tell you if you're doing something that maybe goes against the convention. Documentation generation, we worked on something there too. And then there are other members of the community that have built tools like a version manager for Swift, like CH-Swift. Boris worked on that. SwiftCheck, Quick, Nimble. These are all great projects that try to fill the void, but there are still opportunities. And I think I really say the word opportunity as a way for everyone in the community to actually make this ecosystem a much better ecosystem to work in. And so these different concepts, these different projects, these tools that I find are missing from the development workflow are really a large hole in the development experience. And so not all of them have their uses all the time, but they certainly do make certain types of development way easier. And the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more choice you have as a developer. And you don't have to choose to use every single popular new tool that's out there. Because as we'll discuss in just a few moments, there are some risks associated to these tools too. But it is nice to have a choice. So things like code generation. I think the Swift team has made a very deliberate decision to avoid anything like macros, but there are still times in which that is an indispensable tool. I mean, you look at the Swift standard library itself, and it uses tons of code generation, yet it's not something that the Swift team has necessarily spent the efforts or prioritized in a way to actually release a tool for us. We currently can't see what our test code coverage is in Swift. That's a big problem if you're trying to ship reliable, tested software. These are critical tools that we've taken for granted in Objective-C, and they're tools that we really can't live without, but we've had to avoid using them because they just don't exist. Static code analysis. This is something that I think Clang actually does really well for Objective-C, but the Swift support for this is basically non-existent. Other types of instrumentation, such as performance monitoring or more LLVM intermediate representation manipulation. These are really powerful tools that would allow us to have a better debugging experience, just a better programming experience in general. And actually, I think that all of these tools and all these concepts can actually be built by us in the community. Some of them are tricky, but they're tricky for Apple too. And that certainly shouldn't be stopping them in the future, hopefully. So with all these types of tools, you may be wondering yourself, well, I don't work at Apple. I don't have access to all their source code. I don't know how Xcode is laid out. I don't have access to those classes. Well, there are a few different approaches that you can take to build this kind of tooling. You can spend a lot of time reverse engineering. And this is actually something that's proven very useful for a lot of these tools. AppCode's done a ton of reverse engineering to see exactly how Xcode goes through its process and try to mimic that and even improve on that whenever possible. It's certainly something that we've done a lot working with the Swift AST, working with SourceKit, and it's something that can really yield great positive results. So you can reverse engineer with a disassembler. You can use class dumps in Objective-C and hope that the Swift stuff is actually calling into that. But there are other ways. You can build Xcode plugins. And even though they're not supported, there's still a lot of literature out there in terms of how to build in your own Xcode plugins. And Xcode itself is really just this huge bag of messy plugins. So this is something that's been very useful as third-party projects. You can hook into Clang. You can hook into SourceKit. You can build plugins for AppCode, which I've been plugging a lot, but I do really think that it's a good example of the community taking matters into their own hands. So there's a wealth of ways that you can actually hook into the tools that are already out there to build these better tools. And really, Apple's no different than us. They're still just a bunch of developers. Sure, they know the internal timelines and they have an idea of what other teams are building most of the time. Sometimes they don't. But ultimately, they're still going to have to tackle these hard challenges, and they're still going to have to use the same approaches. They have a little bit more insight into how things are built, but ultimately, we're just as capable of doing a lot of these things. Well, Apple is very different than us in a handful of regards, and the number one is risk. So as third-party developers, as outsiders to Apple, we have no clue, generally, what's going to come out 2 weeks from now at the next WWDC. And so what if you end up spending weeks of your time building this really useful tool, and then a few weeks later, Apple comes out with a better and improved version of it because they've had a year to work on it. They could dedicate engineering resources. They had access to all the internals. But ultimately, you can get Sherlocked if you try to build one of these tools and then Apple goes and build the same thing. And really, you can look at where that's happened in the past. You look at apps like Reveal, and then Apple came around in Interface Builder and added in their own kind of 3D introspection of your views. Reveal is still around. Reveal is still going strong, actually, and they decided to focus on what made their product strong, what made their tool strong. It doesn't have to be backed by a company. But I will say something, though. If your company actively relies on one of these tools that may or may not continue to exist for the foreseeable future, you're taking a major risk there, right? And I think as general business advice, you should probably minimize the number of critical dependencies that you have, especially those that are uncertain, because you're being incredibly courageous. And then something could happen at the last minute and your company could really be in major trouble. But I think that's just general business advice, and that's something that you have to measure for yourself. So how can we actually improve the tooling situation? Well, number one, we can help Apple. Apple, I find, especially for Swift, has been more and more vocal in the developer community. The Swift compiler team has been taking to Twitter, and they've been working with a number of people in the community to actually fix bugs and even sometimes do unofficial support over Twitter. And I think it's important for us to leverage this and to know that ultimately the engineers at Apple aren't that different from us. They're still just trying to build the best tools and to build the best development experience for us. And they're doing so on tight deadlines and difficult company constructs sometimes. And so, for example, there's this open source repo of Swift crashes, Swift compiler crashes on GitHub that have just been maintained by the community. And Apple has been actively looking at this as a way to resolve bugs. And so when 6.1 beta 3 of Xcode came out, it actually fixed a lot of the issues that were reported in there. And so if we put in a little bit of effort, we can actually help Apple help us. We can talk to the people who work on these projects at Apple. There are parts of the tooling that really do need work, parts like XT-test. And it's important to not feel like we're completely helpless in this situation and to reach out whenever we can and to try to encourage conversation. Sometimes you're going to manage to find someone on Twitter. Most of the time, with Apple's secrecy, you're just going to be able to hit them on the developer forums or by filing a radar. And we all know how much of a black hole that is. But nonetheless, if we don't try, it's going to be difficult for Apple to actually see where the problems are in the community. So the number one way that we can help improve the tooling for Apple developer platforms is to help Apple help us. But there are other ways. We as the community have been fairly resourceful in terms of coming up with reasonable solutions to these problems. So again, plugging app code, I think they've done a great job. It's of course taken them probably about a decade or more of work in building this infrastructure to build IDEs, and then they have a dedicated team that's building this product. And so it's certainly not something that a lone developer can necessarily do on their own, but it's something that is within our reach. There are tools like swiftdoc.org. Nate Cook worked on this and actually had a prototype up just in a matter of weeks after WWDC. And so this is a way, if you don't know this site, I really recommend you check it out. It's a way to see the Swift standard library as HTML documentation. So it's online, and you can see what types inherit from what, and it's a very useful tool. This was done entirely as a community project with essentially no help from Apple. CocoaPods added Swift support. If you see Marius later, he was a big proponent of this and ended up doing a lot of the work here, but it was really a massive community effort. Carthage, other tools that have come up to really solve these problems. SourceKitten is this wrapper around the private SourceKit framework that allows you to manipulate the Swift AST. So this allows you to build other tools like documentation generation. Tools like Jazzy generates HTML documentation for Swift projects. Or things like SwiftLint, which again, we just released today, and it does something like this. It'll go through your source code and then see if you're doing things like force casting or using style that isn't necessarily common practice. And this is a tool that we can improve. These are all tools that we can improve. And that's really the gist of it, is that we can leverage the community that we have, which is really an amazing community. And the projects that I've shown here are really just a handful of examples of what the community's been doing, for Swift at least. And of course, the community's been doing this for even longer in Objective-C. There's some amazing tools that are out there. And we should really continue to do this, and we shouldn't feel like it's outside of our reach to build these tools. So leverage the community. And especially this conference, I've met so many people here who have had huge contributions to this Swift tooling problem, or huge contributions to fixing it. Anyway, so if you bump into Brian Jeziak of Quick, or Marius, or the App Code team, or the Facebook team, and many other people have been helping fix this problem. So there's a number of resources that you can check out to see how other useful tools to help fix the Swift tooling problem have been built. The tools that I've been mentioning in this talk. These slides will be available as well. I'll make sure that UIKonf can retweet where the link is or something like that. But really, what I want to leave you with is that I want you to feel comfortable to go out there and build the tools that you find are missing. It's within your power. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.